everyone. I'm Dr. Surbhi Unyal and I teach philosophy at the School of Liberal Arts, Bennett University. We are doing a lecture series on Indian knowledge system from a philosophical perspective. And in today's lecture, we will be discussing the concept of Ātman in the Indian knowledge traditions. Ātman is the fundamental concept in Indian philosophy. It refers to the universal self, the eternal essence of an individual's personality. After death, it either undergoes rebirth in a new life or achieves liberation, which is moksha, from the cycle of rebirth. So, we are specifically going to deal with this notion of the self or the Ātman and how this self has been understood in various traditions. And if we talk about how the self has been seen, it can be seen as something which undergoes rebirth, being born into a new life, or that which attains liberation or moksha from the cycle of rebirth. If we talk about its etymology, it is the Sanskrit term Ātman. It derives from the root an, which means to breathe, and at, which means to move, suggesting the soul as the animating principle of life. The word Ātman is etymologically connected to the root an, means to breathe, linking it originally to breathe or the life force. This connection situates Ātman among the vital functions of life, that is, pran, which is the breath, manas, mind, and the jeev, which is life or soul, and reveals its role as a sustaining and animating principle. So, etymologically, if you look at this term, it basically refers to the breath or the life force, which means it is seen in a more as a pran or the vital function of life. So, it is seen in a as a more animating principle. So, Indian knowledge systems place the inquiry into the nature of soul at the very center of philosophical investigation. The question, who am I, koham, has driven millennia of sophisticated analysis, experiential investigation, and systematic exposition across diverse schools of thought. This exploration, it includes not merely theoretical speculation, but practical methodologies for direct realization of one's essential nature. So, the very important and the primary question in this philosophical investigation is to look for the answer for who am I? Who is this self? And in order to understand this notion of who am I or what is the self, who is the self, rather than just talking in a more abstract philosophical concept, we'll see that in the Indian tradition, it's more of an experiential investigation, that how one realizes their true self, how one experiences the self, and through that different accounts of the self has been given in different schools of Indian philosophy. So, it's not just a mere abstract notion. In fact, it is seen as a more experiential investigation. And in this experiential investigation, one actually tries to realize what this self or the Ātman really is. The Indian philosophical traditions, they developed the metaphysical understanding of Ātman than a simple vitalism. The Upanishads, they distinguish between different aspects of selfhood. The gross physical body, the sthula sharir, the subtle body containing the mind and the vital energies, and the causal body representing the soul's deepest essence. And these are the ways in which we'll see that how Upanishad talk about the notion of self in these different ways, be it a physical body or a subtle body which contains mind and the vital energies, and the causal body wherein it represents the soul's deepest essences. So this trifold analysis, it recognizes that what we commonly consider self operates at multiple levels, with the true self transcending all limited identification, while simultaneously being their innermost reality. So these different ways of understanding the self, how these threefold analysis recognizes the self, that how it operates at multiple levels. And within these multiple levels, the true soul being that which transcends all limited identification, but at the same time being their innermost reality. If we look for the origin of this term Ātman and or the concept of Ātman, we can trace it back again to Vedas, and we can say that the earliest references of Ātman is in the Rig Veda, which presents it primarily as a life breath or the vital principle that animates all existence. The famous Nasadya Sutta, it speaks of the one that breath without breath, introducing the paradoxical nature of the supreme Ātman that transcends ordinary vital functions while being their source. So we can see the paradoxical nature in the sense of describing it as one that breathed without breath. So we can see it as paradoxical because we are talking about it being there, but at the same time it's transcendental. So the supreme Ātman, we can say it is something that transcends original vital functions while being their source, right? And here we can see that there is a paradox or paradoxical way in which it has been understood. The Rig Vedic concept of Asu, which is life breath, and Ātman begins to suggest an animating consciousness that pervades all existence, laying groundwork for later philosophical developments. And this is where we can see that how this idea then has been taken up in the Upanishads and the later philosophical schools, how then they understand this notion of Ātman as the one which has been just mentioned about, that one that breathed without breath. So that oneness of the Ātman with the Brahman has been taken up in a more systematic way in the Upanishads and the later schools or later philosophical schools. Then we can say that they represent the earliest expressions of the worldview in which life and consciousness are interconnected and essential. This becomes the foundational in the Upanishads, where Ātman evolves into the notion of the universal self or consciousness, an eternal, unchanging reality that underlies all existence. Therefore, the Rig-Vedic use of Asu and Ātman subtly it initiates a philosophical trajectory that culminates in the sophisticated metaphysical systems of classical Indian thoughts. Now, if we talk about this concept of Hiranyagarbha, which is the golden embryo or golden womb, it represents one of the most profound early articulations of cosmic consciousness that bridges individual and the universal Ātman. So, through this concept we can again situate the discussions on Ātman and how that Ātman is related to the universal Ātman. And through this concept of the golden embryo or the golden womb, it represents this cosmic consciousness that bridges the individual and the supreme Ātman. So, first appearing in Rigved, the Hiranyagarbha Sutra, it describes the primordial creative principle that encompasses all existence. So, in the beginning arose Hiranyagarbha, born as the sole lord of all existence. He held up the earth and this heaven. Who is the God to whom we shall offer our oblation? And through these understanding, we will see that how it's talking about the universal Ātman or the oneness of the individual with the universal. So, this golden embryo, it represents consciousness in its creative cosmic aspect, the universal Ātman from which all individual souls emerge and to which they ultimately return. So, how this golden embryo is seen as the in a way something from which all individual souls they emerge and they eventually go into that universal Ātman. Talking about Ātman in Upanishads. So, Ātman is the central theme across all of the Upanishads, with the aim to know your Ātman, serving as the recurring philosophical focus. So, throughout all the Upanishad, the primary aim or the central theme is to understand this notion of Ātman, or to know what this Ātman is, or to know thyself, know yourself. And in knowing yourself, you realize the union of the individual with the supreme or the universal Ātman. And that basically is the central theme across all the Upanishads, and then described in different ways through different stories and different arguments. But the central theme remains to be the same. So, these ancient texts, they describe Ātman as both the vital breath within human beings and the ultimate imperishable essence of the universe, the divine core that neither originates nor perishes. In the Upanishadic worldview of the self, is not equated with body or mind or ego. Rather, Ātman represents the true inner self, the essence of individual identity that reflects the cosmic order. So, moving beyond the vital breath which has been described in the Vedas, Upanishads try to describe it even further and see it in a more metaphysical, philosophical sense. So, in the Upanishadic worldview, the Ātman is not equated with the body, neither with the mind, because sometimes we might consider mind to be immaterial, and therefore we might think that self is equivalent to mind, which is the Western notion of mind and the soul, wherein if you talk about the Cartesian dualism, where mind and body are seen to be distinct and mind is seen to be equivalent to soul. So therein they talk about body as distinct from the mind and mind equivalent to soul, and therefore mind and soul are being used interchangeably. But in the Indian philosophy, particularly in the Upanishadic perspective, mind, body or ego are considered to be separate from the self. So here in Indian philosophy and Upanishadic Indian perspective, mind is not equivalent to soul. Therefore, body, mind or ego are not equated to Ātman. And then what does Ātman really is? What is this true self? So this true self basically represents the true inner self, and this, the essence of which is the individual identity, and this individual identity, it reflects the cosmic order. And there is the relationship between Ātman and the Brahman. Brahman being the universal principle of being, consciousness, bliss. That means Sat Chit Anand. And this is represented through two primary perspectives in the Upanishad. So realizing, or you can see the relationship that we can see between Ātman and the Brahman. So when one realizes and get equated to, or there is a union that takes place between Ātman and the Brahman, that is the state of Satchitanand, which is pure bliss, or you can say pure permanent bliss, wherein one has realized the union with the ultimate, which is the Brahman. So some texts affirm the identity of Ātman and Brahman, emphasizing a non-dual understanding of reality, while others they maintain a distinction, suggesting that Ātman is a part of Brahman but not entirely identical to it. This early philosophical tension, it gave rise to range of dualistic and non-dualistic interpretation of the Hindu thought. So how to understand this relationship is very important in order to understand different philosophical schools who have given different notion of seeing this relationship of Ātman and the Brahman, where some consider to be identical, while according to some, these two concepts are not identical, though Ātman is a part of Brahman, but it's not identical to it. And therefore there emerged number of schools which have given different notion of this relationship. If we try to understand the notion of Ātman from the Upanishadic point of view, it is important to talk about the Mahavakyas. So the Upanishads, they contain 4 primary Mahavakyas, which are the great statements that encapsulates this revolutionary insight from different perspectives. So the 4 Mahavakyas, or the 4 great statements, are the first being Tat Tvamasi, which is thou art that. From the Chandogya Upanishad, it addresses the seeker directly, pointing to their essential identity with Brahman, wherein it is shown that you are that. And in this statement, that refers to Brahman. So it is like showing the other by pointing out that you are that you are basically Brahman. So making the other realize that you are the Brahman. The second Mahavakya is Aham Brahmasmi, which means I am Brahman. So this statement, it represents the first person realization of this truth. In the earlier one where we said Tattvamasi, that thou art that, it was like realizing the other that you are that. While in Aham Brahmasmi, it is when one realizes the Brahman and therefore giving a first person perspective of the realization of this truth that I am Brahman. So one has realized that that person, or from the first person perspective, is Brahman. Then is I am Atma Brahman, that is, this self is Brahman. From the Mandukya Upanishad indicates the self as the object of knowledge that is identical with the ultimate reality. So this self is Brahman is basically trying to indicate that the self as the object of knowledge, and this self which is the object of knowledge is identical with the ultimate reality, or with the supreme knowledge or the supreme truth of the Brahman, and sees this identity, or you can say the self as the object of knowledge that is identical with the ultimate reality, and therefore this statement is uttered, which is this self is Brahman. The last Mahavakya is Prajnanam Brahman, which is consciousness is Brahman, which reveals the fundamental nature of reality as pure awareness. So these statements are not mere intellectual propositions, but pointers of direct realization, each offering a different doorway to the same ultimate recognition. So we can understand it as consciousness is Brahman, self is, you can say, self is identical with the Brahman, then you are Brahman, and ultimately Aham Brahmasmi, that I am Brahman. And these four statements or Mahavakyas describe how the Ātman is seen and the relationship between the Ātman with the Brahman. So the Mandukya Upanishad then provides a precise map of consciousness through four states. In waking state, which is Jagrat, we identify with the physical body and external world. In dream, which is Swapna, consciousness creates entire world or worlds internally, revealing its creative power. The third is in deep sleep, which is Sushupti. So the individual awareness merges into pure being without object consciousness. Yet we still exist and can report the experience of the rest. There is no subject-object division, no dreams, no thought, yet being continues. Upon waking, one can recall having slept well, suggesting a subtle awareness without mental activity. So this state is the key because it reveals the presence of Ātman beyond thought, unaffected by the ego or perception. So it is a glimpse of pure being, a state without duality, but yet not realized as such. The fourth state is Turiya, is not another state but the unchanging witness consciousness that remains constant through all three states. So, this is our true nature as Ātman Brahman. It is the pure subject which is beyond time, thought and ego, and is identical with Brahman, the infinite, indivisible reality. So, we will continue this lecture and we will discuss Ātman in different other Upanishads and also different schools of Indian philosophy. So, stay with us to understand the concept of Ātman in these different schools of Indian philosophy. Thank you.